With the time we've got left, I'm going to jump over the Labor Party, and we've got a question.
Thank God for that.
Question for the Liberal Party, and it's from Joanna Chin. We'll just get a microphone to you, Joanna.
No, that's Tanya, but...
Sorry, hang on a sec. We'll just get a microphone to you. There we go.
Thank you. Now that Tony Abbott is Prime Minister, would he be looking into other economic reforms to strengthen the Australian economy, apart from the repeal of the carbon tax?
George Brandis.
Well, he certainly will. And of course, as I said before, we put the repeal of the carbon tax front and centre of our election campaign, but that's not the end of our economic agenda. We've got an ambitious agenda to create 2 million jobs. We have to start repaying this enormous burden of debt that the Labor Party has left us.
Can I put it to you that is not an economic reform? Paying
off the debt.
No, that's not.
Well, I beg to disagree with you.
It may be good economic management, but it isn't an economic reform.
Well, I suppose it all depends what you mean by the.
I think what carbon pricing.
May I answer the question, please?
If you would, yes, that'd be great.
I consider paying off the mountain of debt that that the Labor Party raked up in less than 6 years a very, very important economic priority. Absolutely.
Okay, but that's fair enough. It is an economic priority for you. It is not an economic reform. So the question is, are there economic reforms, I think that's correct, apart from the carbon tax or repealing the carbon tax, that you are about to engage in? Is there a reforming agenda that we don't know about?
There's no. Well, this is a no surprises government. There's no agenda that nobody knows about. There is no agenda that nobody knows about. There is no agenda that other than what we set out in our election campaign, in our policies, in our real solutions document. That was the most detailed economic and social agenda that any political party has brought before the Australian people in 20 years.
Oh.
And if you want, if you want to know, then it was all laid out before the public during the election campaign. Repaying the debt, repealing the carbon tax, repealing the mining tax, creating the modern infrastructure that the economy needs, particularly the road infrastructure, creating 2 million jobs, reducing the cost of living pressures on families, restoring business, particularly small business, to profitability, having a root and branch reform of the competition laws, particularly from the point of view of the interests of small business, developing the North. I think that's a pretty good agenda.
I think if there was one reform you didn't mention, I think it's the only real reform the Liberals are interested in, and that will be IR reform. I think they're seriously interested in having a crack at IR. I'm not sure they've worked out how far they're prepared to go, how far they're game to go, but that will be the area to watch, because there's no question they will have a crack there.
Can I say, the idea that Real Solutions program was detailed at 17 pages is the funniest thing I've heard all night.
Well, you obviously read the wrong document, Tanya.
Getting rid of carbon pricing. You keep talking about the carbon tax. We've moved to a floating price now. So what you're talking about is getting rid of carbon pricing. You're talking about getting rid of a market mechanism.
Well, you actually haven't moved to a floating price because you didn't legislate for it, and that was the problem. That's the fundamental. Okay. It's a promise that never actually happened.
But what they're talking about is getting rid of carbon pricing altogether.
A floating carbon tax.
Talking about getting rid of a market mechanism for reducing pollution and instead taxing everyone to pay big polluters, maybe to drop their pollution a bit. If it costs more than you've set aside for it, then the pollution target goes. You've already said that. When it comes to the other things that you've mentioned, you're talking about the cost of living, for example. Mortgage interest rates have never been lower. People on a $300,000 mortgage are paying $6,000 a year less on their mortgage than when we came to government. After 10 successive interest rate hikes under the Howard government, after the promise that mortgage interest rates would always be lower under a Liberal government. Just as one example, you're getting rid of the school kids bonus.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It doesn't mean very much as if you're fighting the last election campaign.
It does sound a bit like that, but the question was about economic reform from the coalition. I'm going to throw to Michael Kroger. Do you identify among those policies any major economic reforms?
I do, but and I don't want to dodge the question, but I'm not part of the government. We have a new government, and I can't speak for George or Joe Hockey or Tony Abbott, because that would be...
I'm just talking about you as an observer, looking at the document. Do you see in amongst them major economic reforms?
I do, but as I said, I'm not going to interfere with them. And that's for Joe Hockey to announce, and Andrew Robb and Tony, and not for me.
Oh, so none that have been announced so far then?
Sorry, what's your question?
Whether you've actually seen announced any major economic reforms from the incoming government?
Well, they've announced basically $40 billion of cuts to federal government spending. That has got to be a reform because, as we know, Tanya's left behind $300 billion worth of debt. Oh, it's nothing. It's $12 billion a year.
You're cutting...
You can't shrug it off,
No, you're cutting $40 billion and you're spending, 34 or 36.
Yeah.
It means that you come back into a surplus at the same time as us. Over 4 years, you're saying that you'll spend $6 billion less than we would have. That's $1.5 billion a year. In a budget the size of the Australian budget, most people would call that a rounding error.
Okay. As I was saying...
Well, if you regard $6 billion as a rounding error, Tanya, I think that kind of sums up a lot of the problem.
No,
Tanya, you're leaving a $12 billion...
budget is very little.
You're leaving a $12 billion interest bill a year behind you, $300 billion in gross debt, rising unemployment, and interest rates are only low, Tanya, not because the economy is good, because the economy is rotten. That's why interest rates are so low in this country. And for you to come on and say, oh, we did a great job during the GFC, well, if you did such a good job, why did you sack Kevin Rudd? The bottom line is you spent...
I'd like to interrupt. No, I'd like to interrupt this. Okay, all right, briefly.
If the debt is such a problem, why are you not coming back to surplus sooner than you are?
Well, the answer to that is that the policies that Tony Abbott and co are going to bring in are designed to increase GDP in this country. If you increase GDP in this country, you increase the tax base. And that's basically the way the government is proposing to pay down debt and to reduce the budget surplus in addition to the measures that have already been mentioned. But because the economy is so weak, you can't take billions of dollars out of the economic infrastructure of this country because you will damage the economy further. And because it's so weak, because unemployment is going to 6.25%, and because your Finance Minister Penny Wong and your predecessor Treasurer Wayne Swan left $116 billion of errors in the 11-12 budget. That's one of the reasons this economy is in such a mess, because of you.
Now, Michael, now my question to you, just to sort of finish off, do you think the business community, for example, is looking to see major economic reforms coming from the coalition government, either in the area of industrial relations, as suggested there by Graham Richardson, or, for example, taxation? Because there's a cry for taxation reform from economists and from the business community that I've heard, and I'm just wondering, is the coalition going to respond to it?
Well, the business community will always want things which are going to be, assist them in increasing profits. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but all these things are a matter of balance. And that's why, quite frankly, I think Abbott's going to be a very good Prime Minister.
Lenore Taylor.
Well, I think the take-out message from that whole exchange is that a lot of the policies that Tony Abbott will rely on to make good his economic promises, we don't know yet. They've been put out to reviews beyond the election. So tax policy, industrial relations policy, competition policy, foreign investment policy. We don't have those detailed policies. Childcare policy is another one. They're all going to be reviewed and we'll find out about them later. So in the absence of those detailed policies, what we do have is statements of intent, which may or may not happen. But I don't really see, if you don't come back to surplus any quicker, how you're going to do anything about the debt more quickly either. And also sort of grand statements of things that are going to happen. I heard Andrew Robb say on the weekend that the coalition government would reboot the mining industry. Now, it may be that business confidence improves under the coalition. That could well be. But the investment boom in the mining industry came off because Chinese growth slowed. And as significant an event as Tony Abbott's ascent to the Prime Ministership is, I don't think it's going to do anything for Chinese growth.
George Brandis, I'll give the word to you because we've got to go out pretty soon.
Well, I think the greatest thing that could have happened in Australia to restore business confidence was a change of government. I mean, if the business community had absolutely given up on the Labor government. There was no policy integrity, there was no policy predictability, there was no stability in the government itself and the personnel in the senior economic and other portfolios. So by the mere fact of a change of government with the clear direction Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey and others have set out, I think is the best thing that could possibly have happened for business confidence, for business confidence in Australia today.
I'm afraid that's where we'll have to leave it. We've run out of time. Please thank the panel: Lenore Taylor, Graham Richardson, George Brandis, Tanya Plibersek and Michael Kroger.